Time to let me get us started. So the maximum time to interact with our with our speaker, and we have a really exciting speaker today. My name is Hannah Riley Bowles. I'm research director here at the Women in Public Policy program. As you know, our work here focuses on gender gaps in the areas of economic opportunity, political participation, education, and health. So we're really kind of looking across the board, trying to narrow things. Today, we have a wonderful, this is our first seminar of the semester. We will meet every Thursday at this time. And today we have Pippa Norris, who is one of those rare people who is a genuine academic. And no, you are a genuine academic, but also you have real impact on practice. And a lot of us sort of do that. We're kind of good at one and do the other on the margins. And I think actually Pippa is one who really genuinely does both things. And you'll forgive me looking at my notes, but there's so many, she has so many accolades, I was unable to put them to memory. But Pippa Norris is the McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics here at the Kennedy School, but she is also a Laureate Fellow of the Australian Research Council and a Professor of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney. She is a political scientist and a public speaker. Her research compares election and public opinion, political communications, and gender politics. She served as the director of the Democratic Governance Group in the United Nations Development Program, and she has been an expert consultant to many international organizations, including the World Bank, as well as the United Nations, the Council of Europe, the OSCE. She was really very influential thinker in these domains. She recently, at the University of Sydney, launched the Electoral Integrity Project, which is a multi-million-dollar 5-year research study that's going to open with a workshop in Madrid. Or I guess open this summer with a workshop in Madrid. And then she has been awarded numerous prizes, and among these, I'm just going to highlight a couple. The Johan Skytte, is that correct? It is. Skytte Prize for contributing innovative ideas about the relevance and roots of political culture in the global context. She has won prestigious awards from the Australian Research Council, including this Kathleen Fitzpatrick Australian Laureate Fellowship and special recognition from the United Kingdom's Political Studies Association. So this, you know, she's globally really been a truly influential thinker in academic as well as practical corners. And I don't even know if I need to go on with your degrees and all that stuff. So I'm gonna stop there because I think you're getting a taste. I think you're probably you all want to hear from her and not me at this stage. But what she's going to talk to us about today is gender equality in elected office, applying the 6-step action plan to the Egyptian case. So Pippa, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Such a generous introduction. And thanks to WAP, because I remember WAP when it was first started. And it's flourished and gone from strength to strength under Iris and all the others who have been working. So it's a pleasure to be here. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is one of the issues which is clearly central to the work of WAP, women in elected office. And just to give you some background, what this is a report which I produced with Mona Lena Crook, who's now at Rutgers University. And we first started this with a short report for the OSCE, thinking about the problems of Eastern Europe and Central Europe. In some countries, women have really moved ahead in that region. In others, they haven't. What we found was that other people were really interested. So now they've just, I got a note today, translated this into Arabic. So it's going to go into a variety of countries there where OSCE is working, in Libya, in Tunisia, and so on. It's also been of interest to Latin America. So I'm going down to Mexico to the tribunal, the electoral tribunal, and they want to work with OAS to translate it and contextualize it there. And we've also produced a similar report for UNDP Asia Pacific. So my friends over there said this is great for us as well. So it's going global. As somebody said, we should have actually started global and gone to regions, but it went the other way. Because people found it useful. So that's a really good testament. And it's also something which we want to go through today and really apply it today. Not just talk in theory, not just talk in the abstract, but we're going to break up into pairs and we're going to apply it to a case. And then we're going to come back to talk about what recommendations you would make given this sort of background. So what we wanted to do was to integrate how people could think about this. And we did this presentation, by the way, for a meeting in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. So this is kind of framed towards Asia, but it can be applied to countries worldwide, including, of course, the USA, which seems absolutely, there's no discussion whatever of this in the current climate, as far as I can hear. Yesterday you saw the television, right? So the women senators were paraded, which was great. Everybody patted on the back. But were there any talks about structural reforms? Any? No, not at all, none at all. Right, so let's talk first about the trends, and I'm going to apply it first just to the Asian context, just to show you some of the patterns. Then we're going to talk about what potential drivers of change might be out there to try and increase the number of women in office. And I'm going to say that some of them are very long-term factors, but changing them is very difficult. What we can do, however, is work with the 6-step plan, which is 6 alternative options. And I presented this in Ulaanbaatar to women and party leaders and others from all the different countries in North Asia. And they could all say, well, we can't do this, but this might work. This isn't on the table for our parties or for our country, but that might be something we could try. So what it's trying to do is open up the policy agenda, as always, and to say, okay, there are many, many barriers to change, but there are some which you can try. So the 6, as you can see, are constitutional change. And obviously in a country like Egypt or Libya, which are going through transitions, that's the first thing on the table. If women can get their voice into that process, as they did in Iraq and Afghanistan, you can really institutionalize this. But of course, many countries have got problems of, and are not going to change their constitution. The United States, by the way, is the most rigid in terms of not changing. Most other countries change their constitution roughly every 17 years or so. But if you can't do that, what about the electoral system? So we're going to think about what options might be there, and there are a variety of different ways of changing the rules of the game. If you can't do that, you might think about legal quotas, by law introducing gender through a variety of different mechanisms. That's a very popular option in many countries, particularly in developing countries which are moving towards democracy. But if you can't do that, maybe you can change within a particular party. So you can change a socialist party, a Christian Democrat, a Labour Party, a Conservative Party, maybe even the American Democrats. You can change how people get selected, what the rules are, what the procedures are. If you can't do that, you might want to think about capacity development. And that's really a wide range of different things to change the image of women in politics, to try and increase the training and the skills. And it's not that simple thing of public speaking. It's much broader than that. It's not just getting women in, it's giving women and men the skills to be effective when they get into parliament, particularly in new parliaments where women haven't necessarily had any background, and indeed the men haven't either. And if you can't do that, you also want to think about the parliamentary body, the elected body. And again, it's a little bit like management. We're always saying, how do you get women into management? But if you get women in and they're a minority, but they play to the masculine rules of the game, they're not necessarily going to play to their strengths. So you have to say, what is it about the actual institution? And by the way, this applies to the Kennedy School as well. What is it about the institution that might or might not be women-friendly? And think about the basic procedures and what we could do. So let's go through, and then I'm going to first just talk about the trends. Here's some of the patterns just to apply it to my Asia-Pacific region. And the first thing is, immediately, as you can see, this is the proportion of women in elected office in the lower house of parliament across the Asia-Pacific region in 2010. What jumps out to you from the pattern? The countries might be a bit small. Can you read it at the back? The label's too small? Okay. What we've got here, New Zealand, but Nepal, Australia, but Afghanistan. So clearly it's not simply rich countries which are moving ahead, although New Zealand is actually really very good, 30%. Not 50%, but 30% isn't bad. Vietnam, Laos, Singapore, Pakistan, Philippines, China. What jumps out to you from that broad graph in the first instance? There's no right or wrong answers. We're just wanting some participation.
Or the US. Where's the US?
The US isn't here because you're not Asia-Pacific, even though Barack Obama says we're facing Asia-Pacific, but we're not quite on that side yet. Jumps out. China? What jumps out about China?
It's above the world average.
It is above the world average, it's true. But it's not that much above the world average. So it's not particularly exceptional. What do you see about the countries at the bottom here? By the way, this does test your global geography. Do you know where Nauru is? Do you know where Palau is? Do you know where the Solomon Island is? What's most common about the countries really at the bottom with no women at all? This is no women at all. It's like Saudi Arabia almost. They're islands. They're the Pacific Islands. And the Pacific Islands have got a real problem. And again, they're trying to address this in the UNDP office. Often they have very, very small parliaments. They have, say, 12 people who are representing the whole, because it's a small population, it's a small country. And so there they've found, especially because they often have very traditional forms of getting in, family connections, that sort of thing, that women are really lagging behind as a proportion. So they're some of the worst in the world, basically. So what else jumps out to you from just the graph?
It's not economy-based.
Sorry?
I'm sorry, it's not economy-based. You think
right.
Japan and some of the other countries with
precisely
might be more...
It's not just money.
Yeah.
Japan, you'd have thought, an established democracy, obviously, very affluent, one of the top OECD countries in the world, but it's really has always lagged behind the rest of the world. Whereas, as you can see, in Afghanistan, one of the poorest countries in the whole world, has really, and again, think about the culture and the traditions and everything else, has really moved ahead. So just developing the poorer countries, Vanuatu, Mongolia, and so on, won't do it. And rich countries can be good, rich countries can be not so good. The other thing that just jumps out to me is the variation. I mean, enormous within one region. And it's not just the regime either. If it was the type of regime, you might find some patterns in the countries at the top, but you have long-established democracies, you have one-party communist states, you have one-party non-communist states, basically Singapore, and you have a wide variety of different types. So that gives us some clue about what's going on. Sorry, please.
Did the previous chart have something to do with how often they have elections?
Well, actually, that's a good point.
How long a term those who are entrenched in office can stay?
It's a good point. It's about turnover and incumbency turnover and what's the rate of incumbency turnover. But it's not actually the explanation for the variation, but it could be an important barrier. If you have a country where the same families or the same ruling dynasties get back time and time again, rather like the US Senate, then you're going to have real few opportunities for outsiders, which includes women. So that's a potential explanation, but it's not the right one for this particular thing. Was that somebody else, please?
Is there a correlation between the number of women in the parliament and the voice that they have?
No, quite simply, there isn't. So it's a very good point. So you can have countries. China, as we see, is pretty good over the world average, but the role of the National Congress is very, very weak because it basically where is power within the Communist Party, and it's within the Central Bureau. So you can have a very weak legislature where women get in, but they can't do that much. And also they might be confined to the backbenches, they might be confined to the committees which don't have real influence, not the Finance Committee, not the Foreign Policy Committee, and so on. So you can't simply go by the numbers to power. They're two different things. But why do we use numbers? Quite simply because that's the MDG. That's the thing which is driving the development community. The proportion of women has been accepted in the fourth MDG as a target for 2015. And why was I invited to go to Mongolia to talk to them about it? Because in Mongolia they're doing really well on lots of MDGs. They're hopeless when it comes to the proportion of women. So they actually knew that that was the pressure. That was why they had to do something, and all the party leaders wanted to do something. They just weren't sure what they should do in that context. So we go by the numbers as a proxy. Let's put it this way also. If there are no women, then they're clearly marginalised. If they get into at least a parliament that's weak, then you might be able to change the rules of the game and give it a bit more influence, and give women more influence within that parliament. Because once you're in parliament, you might be able to stand, also might be able to run for, might be able to get into cabinet, might be able to get into all sorts of other positions. So it's a really symbolic and also substantive important thing. So this just shows you again how bad the Pacific is, but how the other ones vary. And this shows you a little bit about the trends over time. So what you've got here is 1945, the end of the Second World War, right through to 2010, and it's again the proportion of women in elected office across the different regions. And clearly, Australia and New Zealand were really bad in the 1940s, in the 1950s. It's only much more recently that we see this sharp increase. And indeed, in the rest of the world, we can see that it was something going on in the 60s and then in the 90s, which really kicked up the proportion. So this gives us clues about what works and what doesn't work. It's not necessarily something which is unchanged. And again, the Pacific, almost no change whatever. South Asia, suddenly moving up late. So variations across all the regions. I won't go into that. And again, this just shows you the contrasts. So all I've done here is showed you the position in 1990 with women, where they are in each country, and then in 2010. And you can see how in some countries, Nepal suddenly goes up tremendously in the Constituency Assembly. In New Zealand, tremendous increase. In other countries down here which have gone up. And some are flat, India a little bit, not that much, despite all of the discussion of women in local office, in villages, and tremendous success there when it comes to the Lok Sabha, when it comes to the parliament, real barriers. And as we can also see, Mongolia, which used to be really good under the communist era, remember it was a Soviet state, now really pretty bad worldwide. So what's going on? Well, let me give you some explanations and then kind of knock them down. These are things that probably, even though important, you can't do much about. First, is it gender-related development? Now, one of the other things that we mentioned and which Hannah mentioned is the gender gaps in the economy, in the workforce, and especially where women are in the workforce. It's not simply the proportion, but are they not there in management? So that's a potential explanation. But I'd argue that, in fact, the proportion of women in the national parliament has almost nothing to do with the proportion of women in education at all levels, or in the economy, or in other sectors. And a simple contrast, which I've illustrated here between Japan and Nepal, show exactly that issue. Nepal way ahead in terms of the numbers right now, Japan far behind, but it's not clearly because of lacks of education or university education. And again, we can just think about the United States. Women are moving ahead in lots of sectors. And in politics, I'm sorry, we talk about the cliche of the glass ceiling, but nevertheless, there has been very little real change compared with the rest of the world and certainly other affluent countries. I'm also going to argue, and this was really upsetting to lots of people in the UNDP, that it's not democratization. Lots of people claim the two things go hand in hand. Ban Ki-moon comes out with statements and says, you know, we'll democratize, we'll expand human rights, and then women will get in. I'm sorry, no. And I'll show you that. The two things are separate. You can expand democracy without giving opportunities to women, and you can expand opportunities to women without having democracy. So it's not a nice, neat, simple solution that we can apply. Cultural barriers matter, our attitudes, our values, but it's very difficult to change them. And I'm going to argue institutional reforms in the six-step plan are the most effective intervention. Because if you like, they're a ratchet. When you think about all public policy problems, you think about lots of constraints on what you can do. Some of those are long-term secular trends, and ultimately they might help. In the short term, there's nothing much that any politician, any policymaker, any administrator can change. Institutions are something we can shift. So that's where I'm going to suggest. Now let's just show you the evidence to show why this doesn't work. Here's gender-related development, the value in 2005. And you can see gender-related development is a measure by the Human Development Office. And it basically tries to include the gender ratio on lots of the core indicators that they would always use for indicators of development, like education. How many girls are in school as well as how many boys? What's the ratio? And you can see that we have countries here which are very high in GDI, but are very low in terms of relatively the proportion of women. And contrarily, we have a whole bunch of countries here, including Laos, including Cambodia, including Pakistan, that's doing well, but actually have got all sorts of problems for women and girls in their education, in their healthcare, in their welfare, in their broadest sense. So just increasing education and employment won't do the trick, I'm arguing, certainly not in the short term.
And the reverse, I think you could say the reverse from that slide too. Just getting more women in
right.
politics.
That's right.
You won't necessarily get more girls to school.
Especially where you get them in countries where there have been strong women leaders, like in Bangladesh, but the parties and the parliament is very weak. So getting women in is a token gesture. Often in Bangladesh, you'll get women in because it's the spouse of the husband who was not allowed to stand for one reason or another, and they're a party token gesture, but they don't really have much independence. They can't do much. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. So that's right. The two things are separate. And again, we're always wanting to put it all together, right? To say, oh, well, yes, if we just get development, then women will have wonderful opportunities, we get democracy, and it'll all be the best of all possible worlds. I'm sorry, no. We have to make choices, and both are good, both are different. Democracy goes negatively with the number of women in office in the region and worldwide. And you can see this pattern. And again, this is the Freedom House standardized 100-point democracy scale. So these are the countries which are most democratic according to this scale, and these are the countries which are least democratic, for example, North Korea. But you can see that there's almost, the pattern is actually negative. Now, why is that? What was going on? And by the way, this is also true worldwide in the big dip in the 1990s. Why would it be that growth of democracy would not necessarily lead to more women in office?
The Soviets had women voters.
That's right. So in the Soviet era with the Communist parties are very egalitarian, so they actually promoted women well. But of course the parliaments had no power. When they came into the first democratic elections, they often abolished that because that was the old school. One of the first things OSCE told us when we talked to them is, tell us other solutions, not quotas, because we can't talk about quotas in the region. Because quotas were passed and quotas were therefore not something that they could implement. They've kind of weakened that, but nevertheless, I can democratize without necessarily increasing women. And indeed, there can be a trade-off in the first few elections. That's a depressing lesson in some ways, but it's an important lesson to be aware of. Culture matters. This is a question that we've asked in the World Values Survey, and we've asked it in successive waves, and it's a simple question, and I always think all the men must get the right answer and just say no, but they don't. The question is, do you agree or disagree on a 4-point scale, men make better political leaders than women? And so you can agree strongly, disagree strongly, or something in between. And you can see this is the proportion of women in the lower house. And it does appear, although it's partly led by the two outliers, it does appear that a more egalitarian set of values is one which is sympathetic to getting more women into office. Now, we have countries like Iran, which are clearly the most traditional when it comes to that set of attitudes. No, they think men are better political leaders. Why ask for women? Questions?
No, I was trying to read this.
Yes, I know, the little blobs are a bit small. You need to put your glasses on for my slides, I'm afraid. Well, actually, it's because this is quite small, but anyway. Malaysia, India, Bangladesh. India, long-standing democracy. Think about the women leaders, Mrs. Gandhi and others. And yet, traditional attitudes and not really doing very well at the national level. So, in the long term, in other books, I've argued, yes, you can change culture over generations. Younger generations are far more egalitarian than older generations. And by the way, that applies to the men as well as the women. It's not a sex thing, it really is a generational thing. But there are many cultures which are going to change over the next 100 years. It's nothing that I can change. It's nothing that you can change. You can try and change the media, you can try and change education, but you're really never going to change culture. Please, Hannah.
Do you have any data that would help us understand the direction of causality? So, for instance, like Esther Duflo and Rohini Panda's research suggests,
yes,
you know, that quotas could actually help change attitudes.
We can, because remember the World Values Survey is now in its 6th wave. So we've got measures from 1980, 1995, 2000, 2005, now currently 2010. So we can look at when you get a sudden increase in women. Afghanistan is a classic case in point, right? 2004, they suddenly shot up because of quotas. And then you can look at the before and after to see what the change is. And I very much do believe it's an interactive thing. Because when you say women make, or men make good political leaders, you kind of have an image in your mind about who are the leaders. And when you get in an effective woman, then an effective women in parliaments, and they make some impact, then clearly that can change culture as well. Hillary Clinton, I'd argue, might have changed some of the culture in the United States. It's very effective in that role, although she's not the only one who's been in that sort of foreign policy role. So yes, I do believe there's interaction going on here. It's not simply good cultures lead to more women. There's also party culture. That's really important, because you get selected in a party. You don't get selected necessarily just by the whole of the electorate. So what's the culture there? And again, think about the differences between the Democrats and Republicans in how they're going to select candidates. Please.
Kind of going off your question, not only in Parliament, but in other sectors of the country, wouldn't that also help to give an image of a powerful woman and
yes,
also change the culture as well?
Yes. But again, we don't know, it has to be said, I think we don't know a great deal about this. And essentially for us, culture is very much a sociological phenomenon which is based on your upbringing, it's based on your family. Where do you get your culture from? Primarily your parents and your siblings and your village and your area and the schools and the religious authorities. So when we think about a role of women in leadership positions, clearly they can make a difference on all of those things. But if your mother is in a traditional role And that's the role which is being reinforced through the mosque or the church or your community schools. Then the role of women as leaders might not be as important as we might hope in changing, because by the time you think about that, you've gone through lots of other influences as well. But potentially, the more women in leadership, and again, one could test that by looking at patterns over time, the more women in leadership in a variety of roles, for example, in management and the professions, then ultimately the more egalitarian the culture might be. But culture's rather like Jell-O, it changes slowly. It doesn't change fast. Even when you get a dramatic change, which should have a big impact on the culture is kind of resistant. It's slow, because our values are deeply rooted. If they're not, then they're not values, basically. They're just superficial attitudes. So I'm arguing that you can't do much about culture, even though it's important, but you can do something about the rules. So what do we mean by rules, and what do we mean by institutions? Please, Iris.
Before you move on, I have to comment on your comment, because
yes.
So one thing we're up against is the small numbers problem. Because we have so few women in leadership, it drives me crazy. Because there are so few women in leadership positions, what they do, how they behave, whether they're pregnant, whether their company's going to succeed, and whether Hillary's successful in her office, all of a sudden is going to determine how successful women might be as leaders. I mean, I think that's a very interesting observation. I'm not questioning that that's happening, and that research that Rohini and Esther did. I mean, it's a very nice way of kind of seeing is believing.
That's right.
If you see women in leadership positions, you tend to associate women with leadership, but at the same time, there's all these biases that affect our judgments, and there's the availability bias that we have these few women, and then we go, is it Margaret Thatcher, is it Angela Merkel, is it Hillary Clinton, or just it's a huge small numbers problem where one outlier or two outliers or one pregnant woman or one new CEO all of a sudden dominates our discussion on are women successful leaders.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't have an answer to it, but I'm just saying that's something really difficult to be up against. Because these small numbers can really shape the public discourse.
And I'm going to suggest one other thing for WAP, which is, have you heard of Borgen? Which is this wonderful, wonderful... Are you into Nordic noir, anybody? Yes, Nordic noir. Ever since, the murders and the trilogy and so on, we're all into that, right? Well, I've just got on DVD Borgen, which is the best ever. I mean, it's like the feminist West Wing. It's based in Denmark. The woman becomes the leader. Unexpectedly, she's a moderate. And all the challenges and tensions, and ultimately her husband, I won't get into the plot there because I don't want to spoil it for you. But it's a 6-part series, which I'm just hooked on right now. And it's the most realistic depiction I've had in some ways of women in Nordic politics. And she's struggling, trying to change everything. And of course, it's the most sympathetic environment, but nevertheless. But anyway, if you want to, doing that on a coffee evening or something would be perfect. The only thing is, it's a European DVD, because of course nobody here, whatever. But you need a cheap little DVD. But anyway, I'm into Nordic noir over summer. So let's then think about the case, and let's talk about our breaking down into pairs and really discussing it. To get into office, what does it mean? What it means is going through a series of institutional hoops with rules of the game. So there's constitutional rights. What do they say? And what does it say in the Egyptian case that we'll talk about in terms of where women are, what roles they have, what rights they have? Do they even have equal rights on suffrage or in other aspects as well? And sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes the Constitution is not referring to sex or gender per se, but there are basic rules of the game that discriminate implicitly, not explicitly, against women. You've got the legal framework, which is based on a variety of different things. And again, think about the campaign funding laws and the barriers which those have to women in America trying to run for office, the amount of money you have to raise. Well, think if you were in Denmark and you didn't raise any money whatever. Well, of course you don't, because the party will pay for everything, or there's public funding. So the whole concept of raising money, the worst thing that the Prime Minister in this mythical series has to do is she puts on weight during the campaign, so she doesn't have anything to wear. But other than having to buy clothes, she doesn't have any expenses. Well, that's a basic rule of the game. Does that rule in America discuss gender? No. Is it really important for gender? Yes, because of the resources and distributions. Then you have to think about the candidate selection rules. And again, in America, it's kind of open. It's more permeable because of primaries. In most countries, you get selected like you would if you were going for a job. There's somebody on the other side of the table. Victoria will be interviewing me with certain questions. The party members would select you. So again, what are they looking for? And what are the rules of the game? Are they independent? Are they open? Are they impartial or not? You get the demand by party selectors. This is our old supply and demand, which we invented in the 1990s, but people still use. The supply of eligible nominees, that's the women who come forward. And largely, part of the question here is the problem discrimination by selectors, or is the problem the lack of supply of women? And in my work, I show it varies by party, but anyway. You get the pool of parliamentary candidates and what type of seats they're in, what type of positions they're in. Then you get the electorate, which kicks in, and then you get into elected office. So you can intervene at any of these stages. So the 6-step plan says we can think of this right throughout. And what we want to do is to apply this to the case that you've got in front of you, which is the Egyptian case. So I've given you two things. One is a decision tree, which is a little schematic, where what you can do, what I'm going to do is ask you to break down into pairs with the person next to you, or threes if you want to do that, I don't mind, and to think about each of these steps and think if you were advising gender equality in Egypt, which is the case in point, where would you suggest that they should intervene? I won't go into all of this in detail, it goes on forever, we don't want to do that, we'll just let's just highlight a couple of things from, oh, okay, I don't have it on there, don't worry. A couple of things from the briefing handout. The case is a real one. It's slightly dated, but not too dated. The Parliament, of course, as you've seen, has just been about to be re-elected again. But anyway, what we're asking you as a pair is to think about the advantages and disadvantages of any of these different 6 types of intervention for a country like Egypt. How should each intervention be designed? What strategies would you advise? So Egypt was actually quite far advanced in giving women the vote in the region, 1956. And however, ever since they got the vote in Egypt, there's been a consistent pattern of underrepresentation, but it has varied across different years. The opportunities that we now have are really important, but as you can see from the scatter graph, women are very traditional in the number of attitudes, and they clearly lag behind in terms of how far people in Egypt feel that women should be equal. The Egyptian uprising is the context for the case, and what we're asking you to do is to go through this and to say what should be the change in the Egyptian context. I'm going to leave you to read through, but you've got the questions right at the very end, which should frame your discussion. And the questions are, what would be the advantages and disadvantages of each change? So should it be a constitutional shift? Should it be a quota? If it's a quota, what sort of design? Should it be a change in the internal party dynamics? Should it be a change in the parliament itself? And what would you recommend overall that could be done to empower women in Egyptian politics? And think of the Egyptian uprisings as a door that's opening. It's a critical door. It doesn't open that often. When it does open, women need to get their issues onto the agenda if they're going to manage to get into the new forms of elected office in the Egyptian context. But there are many other groups and many other parties who are also pressing for change, and Egypt is a very traditional culture. So how are you going to work in that context and come up with recommendations? If you'd like to work with somebody next to you, or 3 of you, if you're a 3, depending on where you are in your room, what we'd like to do is give you, say, 15 minutes to go through, and then we're going to do a little, I would say a blackboard, but we don't have a blackboard. Oh, we do, we have a whiteboard. Yes, okay. And we'll work out what you'd recommend, and think about it in relation to your own experience, your own background, and what solutions you think might be most effective in this context. Any questions about the exercise?
Can I,
please.
Another question about correlation.
Yes.
Is there any correlation with this?
Yes.
between the women's education and their participation?
This is a graph which simply shows you the attitudes. And all it shows you is that in countries which have attitudes towards women in politics, there's a strong relationship to attitudes towards women in employment as well. And all it's meant to do is to show you that the culture in Egypt is very, very, very traditional. It's more traditional than in Jordan. It's more traditional than in Saudi Arabia, for goodness sake. This is amazing, right? You know, you'd have thought that was the most traditional culture, but no. So you've got to think about institutions that are going to work in that culture.
But I would think that
Recommendations, then we're going to have a feedback and we're going to hear what everybody says, what they would advise the women in Egypt and the men of Egypt to think about for their reforms. Are you all together with some recommendations? Have you got to that stage? Do you need another minute to get to that stage? I know, we're always arguing, which is good. Are we all good? Good? Recommendations. Okay. If we're ready, then what we can do is we can start by thinking through the decision tree. So what I'd like to do is to go through, and those of you who feel that there should be a change to the constitution, since the reform is under debate, what would you recommend for the Egyptian case? What would you say that they could consider? Who'd like to kick in, please? And I'm sorry I don't know anybody's names. So if you'd like to say your name.
My name is Melissa, I'm an MPP too.
Great.
So one of the things that, and we thought of a lot of ideas and ultimately weren't persuaded by very many of them, but we did discuss that the 100-person member constitutional committee that's been written doesn't include a very large amount of women, in fact none or up to 6, which is pretty limited. So we didn't know the best way to actually, I mean it seems very difficult, but that was something we came up to, is to include women up to that committee.
So you'd like to have more women with a voice within the constituency assembly is the very first stage. I think that's an important recommendation, and it has happened in some other constituency assemblies where you say, okay, we're not going to decide overnight, we're not going to create a constitution within 2 weeks, which seems to be what happens in Egypt. We're going to have a long period, and we're going to try and make sure the body itself represents different democratic groups, different interests, different sectors, and all of those other sorts of things. So that might be a first stage of giving women a voice. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You made a comment, though, about the right women. Do you want to just tell people about, you're from Egypt, so.
Hi, I'm Rana, I'm an MPP too, and I'm from Egypt. We were, as part of the conversation we were having, is that it's not just about having women period, it's also having women who believe in equal rights for women. Because, for example, one of the challenges if you have a proportionate system, one of the parties listed on here is the Noor Party, which is the extreme Salafi party. For their proportionate list, they had one woman, and they didn't even put her picture. It was just a picture of a flower. So you have to think about this type of representation and the challenges it presents.
Yes. And what would be the, just to do a counter to devil's advocate, as it were, what would be the advantages of having women from every party? So you might want to have more liberal women who advance gender equality. What would be the opposite advantage of having women from other parties as well? Even from the most conservative?
Just representation of those women, because they exist in the country.
That's right.
And they have views.
And if you want to have essentially debate within each party, then they might feel reticent about speaking up if the culture of the party is much more conservative. But on the other hand, if they feel that very strongly, then they should have a stake in the system as well. So you might want to have women who are conservative as well as women who are more liberal or more Western. Please, can you say your name again, please?
Yes, my name is Halimatu and I'm from Niger.
Great.
To respond to your previous question, I think seeing women that look like you in politics will make you more interested in politics.
Yeah.
This is a phenomenon I think I've seen in Niger, where I come from. We have had a lot of women in politics for a long time, but oftentimes these are women who are highly educated, women who have gone far in universities and a lot of degrees, and the women at the place in rural communities would tell you that they are not interested because this is a woman who doesn't look like me, who doesn't think like me. But now the more you have women who are quote unquote, very quote unquote, normal, the more involved women at the base are in politics, which I think is a good thing.
Right. But I'd still ask you then, I'm going to press you again, how do you do that? At present in the Egyptian parliament we have this category of workers and farmers, and so they're recognized, it's part of the old socialist tradition, and so they're brought in, but is this appropriate or not? Do you want to have another quota which basically tries to differentiate the poorer groups or the workers or farmers? And how can that be positive or negative for women?
A quota is important,
right,
because oftentimes you have the women would end up in the adjunct position, whereas when you have a quota, this is forcing men and women to think about putting a woman on that leadership position.
Right.
But on the other hand, when you have quotas, oftentimes men and some women would, oh, she's there just because of the quota system. She doesn't really deserve to be there. But I think what makes the difference is what the woman does once she's in power. And a lot of times the women who are put in power, because of the weight of how much work had to be done for them to be there, they deliver. They often deliver, and the thought that might come from thinking that she's there because of the quota system actually disappears in a lot of cases.
So we want to have quotas. Does anybody here feel that in the constituency assembly that wouldn't be advisable? Does everybody agree that that might be an important aspect to get women's voices in? In which case, please.
I think we took a little bit different view in terms of the Constitution. Given the composition of the Constitutional Committee,
right,
the likelihood of getting a quota into the Constitution we thought was low.
Right.
So rather than focus there, we focused later down on the decision tree. But what we did put in the Constitution was protections of women that would not inhibit their ability. They may facilitate, but certainly wouldn't inhibit their ability to participate in the electoral process.
So really trying to open up everything at the very beginning in the current chaos of the post-Mubarak regime is incredibly difficult. So getting women into that constituency assembly is very difficult. So do you want to prioritize it, or do you say further down the road, that's what we'll try and do? And remember all these other issues which are also going to be part of the Constitution. So you've got questions about marital rights and divorce and basic issues of guardianship, property ownership, custody. 101 things in the Constitution above and beyond getting women into Parliament. So there's lots of issues on the table. And do you want to press to get women in, or do you want to say wait? What would be that's an argument for waiting, realistic argument. What would be an argument for pushing ahead? Please.
Well, I guess, I'm Anya. I actually sort of am agreeing with you, but maybe thinking about how to negotiate for more so that you're coming from a stronger bargaining position. So, but in the end, I mean, sort of being able to settle for language in the Constitution that's sort of gender neutral, or, you know, it recognizes overall equality, even if the members of the Constituent Assembly don't see women as equal to men, that sets up a precedent and a framework for the future.
That's right.
You know, all men are created equal in our Constitution.
I mean, it does sound realistic to say wait, because we've got many other things on the table. On the other hand, if women aren't at the table for the basic agenda and designing the Constitution, are the men on the more liberal side going to be sufficiently sympathetic to include women's interests, given all the other things which they're trying to debate at the same time?
I think we were talking less about waiting and more about using an alternative model.
Okay.
And the alternative model was the electoral law.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, we'll come to that as our second option. Sorry, your name again.
Wendy. I'm a National Security Fellow.
Perfect.
One of the things I think that you brought up too is I think the quota system is a great way to get women in the door, but having a program to kind of teach them the game that they're going into, so they know how to play that game initially. And then once you get in there, you know, obviously women are different,
right?
And a lot of times the leadership styles or what they bring to the table is not something that anyone's ever seen before. But once they get in their door, they are respected for being in the door, and then they can kind of show the different ways,
right?
And open up the views of other people, and as a way of acceptance.
So partly, Wendy, you're saying capacity development for the women, as well as any formal structures to make sure that they get into the constituency assembly.
Right, because I think at first people are going to volunteer initially. And there might be some women that don't want to get involved in politics because they're afraid. But they might say, okay, this is Sean's a woman now. And they think as a man or a woman putting this person into politics, she's the most qualified. Maybe she doesn't want to do that.
Right.
So maybe Samantha, maybe she might not have the skills, but she has the passion to go there and want to change. So getting her to a level where maybe Sean is,
right,
you know, to put her in. You need programs to set these women up for success when you do put them in that field.
I totally agree, but when do you think about this? You've got to have the constituency assembly tomorrow. It's not that it's got to be waiting until women get the capacity and the training, because these are the decisions which are going on before they came. This is the decisions going on immediately after the Mubarak transition. So women are going to have to go in there even if they fail in the initial stages.
But do you think that could also have another effect on the negative side?
Yes.
Saying she's not capable.
That's right.
It could make us go back many different steps.
And again, we need to come back to the Egyptian context and say, are there women already in law, in the universities as professors? Are there women already in leadership positions in management and in business who could take this position? Are there leadership women in each party who could take this or not? So it partly depends on the existing group. But decisions have to be taken at the early stages. And if you don't get the women in, even if they don't necessarily feel that they're best qualified or whatever, if you don't get the women in when a door opens, then you miss that door. And therefore the constitution gets written. You're frowning, Iris.
No.
In a sense, you have to act. And the danger of going to capacity development is always saying, well, eventually the women will get in if we just whatever. But of course, decisions are really pressing. Please. And sorry, your name again.
Safia, I'm PA1.
Right.
I'm from Morocco. So.
Yes. I'm going to ask you about Morocco in a minute, because it's...
I just wanted to add that, I mean, I think for most of these countries, it's a learning process. So it's a matter of getting women in there, making sure that their voices are heard, and then even, I mean, I think even for men, getting into elected office, you don't have long-term practitioners. You have newly elected people who learn how to do it, and there's no difference between a man and a woman in this context. I mean, I know that in Egypt, education is quite high. I mean, women have access to high education, so there is potential in there. I mean, you can be shy, but as long as you have the passion to represent your rights and to defend them in a context of really traditional society, this is, I think, the right thing to do.
Now tell us, we're going to go on then to the quotas, and tell us about the Egyptian context for how the quotas were introduced in Morocco.
In Morocco, I mean, there are no quotas per se. I mean, I'm just going to talk about the latest instance, which are the elections, the latest elections that brought out the Islamist Party, and it's actually a decline for gender equality in Morocco, because we have only one woman in office who is in charge of family matters. And one of the issues that were criticized for that, and the party said that there was no other able women to be elected, because it's a democratic process within the party. They vote for the people who are going to be brought forward to be elected as ministers. And they said that unlike any other parties, there were no women available for position in office except that woman. Other parties, I mean, it's a coalition, so for them it was, the selection process didn't bring up women. For the other parties where selection is more, okay, so this minister is going to be my brother-in-law, my son-in-law.
Clientelism.
It was more a choice not to promote women, but we went from a cabinet with 4 or 5 women ministers, one with a fairly small minimum role.
Right. So I thought there was a quota in Morocco, but maybe I'm wrong. I thought there was a 10%. But let's then think, what else might we do? Say we're thinking about the constitution and put that to one side because of the issues there. What about the reform of the electoral system, which is very much on the table in Egypt? The current elections, as you may remember, are incredibly complex. There were 3 stages. And every time you thought that it had finished, oh no, there was another stage, until eventually we got to the results. So the electoral system is under debate, and it's a mixed system, meaning it's not all first past the post and it's not all proportional representation. So you can think about balances there. Do you want to increase one or increase the other? And then do you also want to think about quotas by law? What might be the pros and cons? So please.
So we thought about, I'm Shauna, I'm a PhD student in the Dove department, and I follow at the Ash Center.
Right.
And this is Kwon Shin from South Korea, who's a fellow at the Weatherhead Center. We were thinking about the electoral laws. First, we thought that the research has sufficiently convinced us that proportional representation seems to help women.
It does.
So knowing that it's a balance, it might be hard to get all PR, maybe moving more toward PR as much as possible. And then thinking about, I think in Morocco, that it's not a quota system per se, but it's reserve seats. And I think I think the research has convinced me, at least, that quotas within parties are better than reserve seats in terms of getting in women who can actually have a say.
Yes.
So our thought would be also knowing that it's a conservative culture in Egypt and that probably getting an exact half and half, right, a parity law like in France is not going to fly. But knowing that it's currently at about 8 to 10% women's representation, and that seems too low. So what can you do to just get it toward something a little higher, even though you're not going to get 50%? We were thinking about zippered party lists, but you can't zipper it one, zippered is where you have man, woman, and that's by law within parties on the PR lists. But if you can't do that, because it's a culture that's not going to accept women as leaders quite as much, perhaps you could say 1 of every 4. Right. So that you can't have the parties put all the women at the bottom, which seems to be what the Egyptian parties have done in the past. But, so that you have to have mandated placement, but if you can't have 1 of every 2, maybe 1 of every 4 or 5.
Right. So, just to be clear what the system is, it's a mixed system. You've got 2 votes, if you're an Egyptian voter. One is like in America with first past the post, so a whole bunch of candidates with 1 constituency, and that's for 1/3 of the seats. And then 2/3 of the seats are from PR, proportional representation, in a district where you have a list. And the idea is that we'll rank women, say 1 in 2, 1 in 3, 1 in 4, whatever it is, down the list by law, so that parties can't put all the women at the bottom of the PR list. But by the way, when you're suggesting, Shauna, that we should change the PR, at present we've got 2/3 of the seats through PR, so it's quite a lot. So they might not want to increase that proportion, but by just having a gender quota by law within that list, it would make a tremendous difference.
I thought it was half and half, 2/3 is better.
It is, according to the law, and then you can just calculate, so you can work out how many women could get elected if there were 332 members through PR and women were every 3rd or 4th position, etc. Iris.
Question for Shauna, I brought for you just because I don't know. Shauna, in passing you said that the evidence is quite strong that it's better to have
PR
quotas than reserved seats.
Yeah.
How should I think about that? I mean, this is an innocent question. I don't know the literature. Why is it better? Or under which circumstances is it better?
Here's what I understand, and my understanding actually is based on the Morocco case, so maybe our Moroccan friend can fill me in better. What I understand, though, is that the reserved seats tend to be filled in by party leaders of women from prominent political families, and they tend to be more bench warmers or people without much power because they don't come in kind of elected in their own right. They come in through separate elections, and it's ones that matter less somehow.
I think it depends by case.
Okay.
Because when we look at the case of like France, where the party list put all the women at the bottom, like if it's zippered, you end up with a better situation. But I think it depends on sort of who's controlling what in the political parties at the time. If one wants to forcefully work to have women not have a voice, most parties have enough rules and structures that one can make that happen. So, and we haven't quite figured out how to reverse that. That if there's enough energy and activism to make sure that we can use whatever rules and laws that we have to most further women's voices. So my read of it is that it really is more situational.
And it partly depends, because we talk about quotas as though they're all the same thing, which they're not. Are you elected or are you appointed? Totally different. Appointed, then you're at the happenstance of the party leader. If you're elected, you've got your grassroots. And so you can always say no to the party leader. You're not simply a voting token. And you're not simply there because you're the wife of X. And then how many reserve seats or how many women are into a PR quota, absolutely critical. If you have it at 4%, 10% versus 30%. Or 50%. So so the devil is in the detail of all these things, and you need to understand how it works in each system. And you also even need to calculate the number of parties before you can even say how many women there have to be. Because if there's lots of parties, but they only ever get each 3 members, then having a 4-member quota is useless, right? So you really need to go into all the detail and do lots of kind of planning before you can say where things could be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right, Victoria. Devil's in the details. The thing I'm remembering is talking to a woman from Uganda about the reserve seats they had at the time, and this may be out of date. There was something about legitimacy that is hard to understand,
that's right.
but it seemed like that the women's elections were not counted as legitimate
That's
in
right.
some ways, so that if you can get the women into the real elections, that seems to give them a little more power and a little more voice rather than like the fake women.
Although it sometimes depends on the number of times which they've been elected through that process, because then they get more leadership,
Right,
etc.
exactly. You get good women in.
That's right. That's right. They get visibility. And of course you have to say, so we've passed the law, what's going to implement it? What's the penalty for not doing this? Is there a financial penalty? In France they didn't care. Is there a legal penalty that you can't even stand or whatever? We're running out of time.
Yeah, we are, unfortunately.
That's fine. We've raised lots of issues.
Any more closing comments before I...
What's the answer?
What's the answer?
There is no answer. Let's continue to look at Egypt and see what emerges. How do you pass the
Our next speaker next Thursday is going to be Mary Brinton, who's a professor of sociology and department chair at the Reichauer Institute. She's going to talk about low fertility, a theory of normative rigidity and economic context. Interested myself to hear what that's about. But let me close by, please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Well done.